638, the Arab Muslim army was in Syria trying to conquer it. It was hit by an epidemic called the Plague of Amwas or Amawas. It is estimated that about 25,000 soldiers were killed in that epidemic. The plague hit twice, in Muharram and in Safar, and the army started to think about whether to stay or to go to another place. On this question, there were differences of opinions, partly based on varied understandings of a hadith of the Prophet, which said that a Muslim should neither enter nor flee a plague-stricken region. Ultimately, Caliph Umar made the decision that the army should move to a safer place. And as it was doing so, as they were moving to a safer place, Abu Ubaidah, the commander of the army, died because of the epidemic. He was replaced by Ma'ad bin Jabal, but he too died of the disease, and so did his son, who was to be the next commander. And ultimately, the army did reach a safer place, and the Caliph Umar, after losing 3 commanders in quick succession, appointed Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan as the next commander-in-chief. This was a fateful choice, as it eventually concluded in the founding of the Umayyad dynasty. And as we know, the relationship between Muawiyah and Ali and Yazid and Hussein are now considered as the foundational narrative of Shia-Sunni relations. Pandemic is something being discussed quite centrally these days. It is in conversations, from serious scientific research to sometimes muddled, sometimes clear-headed policy discourse, to jokes and memes on social media. The reason I started with a piece of war or war history was to give an example of how these phenomena have shaped human cultures, politics, economics, ways of interacting in everyday lives, and also international relations. People have come together and closer because of epidemic, but some have also become distant. New wars have started and old ones sometimes cease because of them. Fortunes of leaders have changed, new arts was produced, and much more. If we think about the terms that we use, epidemic and pandemic, which I will be using interchangeably here, both have the word demic in them, which comes from the Greek term demos, meaning people, from which we also get the word democracy. Epi means on or upon, so epidemic means something on people. And we use it for a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community or a region at a particular time. Pan, also Greek, means all, from which we also get the term pantheism. So pandemic refers to infectious diseases that spread in many parts of the world. We also have the term endemic, which refers to diseases in one part, but they have become chronic there and people have learned to live with those diseases. So we might say that malaria has become endemic in certain regions of the world. Coronavirus is usually compared with Spanish flu, which spread in 1918 and 1919. And in these 2 years, about 25 to 30% of human population was infected by it. About millions of people died, 12 to 13 millions dying only in India alone. And although it is commonly called the Spanish flu, the 1918 pandemic likely began in the US. It is called Spanish flu because at that time, under the World War I, There was a news embargo on many parts of Europe, and Spain was neutral at that time, so greater news was coming out from there. And so in Europe, it was assumed that this is coming, the flu itself has come from Spain, where that was not the case. And in Spain, they called it French flu, because for them, the flu had actually come from France. So this was just to show some politics and the even in terms of the naming of these diseases, and how the naming itself is sometimes can become a political issue. Now, our concern really is to look at pandemic historically, and particularly in terms of religion. And I perhaps should say that the most widely known pandemic is, and that may be because Europe was centrally affected, was the Black Death, which lasted from 1347 to 1354, originating in some regions around the Caspian Sea. The Black Death then spread to Central Asia, Constantinople, and the Mediterranean ports, from where it invaded Western Europe. It killed about 25% of European population, for example, which was approximately 50 million people. Worldwide, it killed about 150 to 200 million. And if we think about the fact that the world population at that time was only 500 million, the proportion of that is very huge. And in what we now call the Middle East, about 1/3 of the population perished from the disease. And we have from that, but also earlier other pandemics, descriptions of personal diaries and state documents and historical accounts of how bad the situation was. I think it may be fair to say that the worst of today was sometimes norms in those circumstances. And we can see various similarities across these pandemics. One of them is the very huge, the unequal impact on different people. Like in the pandemic we are facing today, some regions and groups were affected more than others, and the realities and divisions of socioeconomics played a key role then as they do now. I will come back to it a little later in the presentation. But with this backdrop, let's now come to the topic of our immediate interest, that is the role of religion and in religious thought in pandemics. Now, in my understanding, looking at the scholarship, there seems to be three broad ways in which we can see the relationship between religions and pandemics. And let me try and discuss them briefly. I will call the first way that of explanatory role of religion. Religions, for most people, provided the explanations for what existed and what was happening around them. That was because God and other minds were involved in the understanding of the cosmos, of the way the world functioned physically as well as socially and politically. That's how people saw. This is what Weber has called the enchanted world. And as the epidemics caused huge sufferings and pain, the most common explanation were to see them as punishments and as tests from God. So they were explained in religious terms and mainly as punishments from God and as trials. And once something is seen as punishment, it raises the question of the sin that resulted in it. In other words, people look for the sinful to hold them accountable as culprit for the punishment. And this is what we see in today as well, in some contexts, the same way of thinking about pandemic as a punishment for the acts of certain groups or certain people. Often the minorities and vulnerable groups are held responsible. During the Black Death, for example, Jews were held responsible. It was accused that they deliberately poisoned wells. In late 1340s, massacres of Jewish people happened in several cities in Europe because they were blamed for the epidemic. Women were also often blamed for the epidemics, and often the minorities are held responsible. Now we can note that this practice of blaming someone for the epidemic continues even today and happens in both religious and secular ways. In the religious narratives, the blame is often put in moral terms, and in the secular scientific narratives, groups can be blamed for not following public health directives. But in both cases, we find blaming. We also see that the epidemics were sometimes seen in apocalyptic terms as signs of the end of the world, as the signs of the time coming to an end, the world coming to an end. In many religious traditions, the descriptions of the end of the world involved destructive events and tragedies, and therefore epidemics were often interpreted as apocalyptic terms. Again, we see this today as well, where in some contexts coronavirus is seen as holding signs of the end of times, professed in biblical books like Book of Revelation, for example, but in other contexts as well. And as part of having religious explanation for epidemics, they are also seen as test, as imtihan. And in fact, often the punishment and the trial narrative come together. So, for example, if we can see this in the current pandemics as well. As you know, in the initial weeks, apart from China, the virus had affected Europe very badly. And some people therefore saw this as a punishment for the European countries for denying Muslim women the right to wear hijab. And it was said that, look, now they have to allow and they are being punished. And when it was pointed out that, look, Iran is also suffering, where hijab is compulsory, the response often was that, well, that is a trial for the believers. So it often happens that the punishment is seen for the others and the trial is seen for the believers. So within the punishment trial explanation of epidemic, there is another dimension, and that is to try to placate gods and to keep them happy so that the punishments can be avoided and God's help can be found. So for example, in India, especially in Bengal, there is a goddess of smallpox called Sitala or Shitala Mata. Now this Shitala is represented by a woman dressed in red clothes, riding a donkey with a broom in one hand and water pot in another arm, and she also has a fan on her head. So this is kind of bringing some comfort and solace to the disease, and her devotees seek her help in keeping the disease away. And so that's another way in which religion, epidemics and pandemics connect. And epidemics sometimes also have caused religious conversions. For example, Europeans brought many new diseases such as smallpox to the Americas. As the Native Americans did not have immunity against these new diseases, they suffered hugely. They of course suffered in many other ways as well at the hands of the Europeans, but this was another way. And there is evidence that seeing that the Europeans were less affected by these diseases, which was for the obvious reason that they had brought these diseases, some Native Americans converted to Christianity. They thought that the God of Europeans was superior to their own gods. And in fact, changing of loyalties to a different god was a common phenomenon, as one role of gods was to protect the people who were believing in that god. So if people felt that their god or gods failed in doing so, they often switched loyalty to gods of the victor. In the book A History of God, Karen Armstrong narrates this phenomena quite a number of times, and I think it is also there in the Muslim narrative after the conquest of Mecca, where we are told that a huge number of people joined the Prophet, and I think that's what was happening there as well, that people were changing loyalties because the new God was more powerful. So in summary, in religious terms, epidemics were often explained in terms of punishments and trials which led to blame, conversion, and placating of gods. That's one interaction that we see between religion and pandemics. A second major way in which religions relate to epidemics was to do, and still to do, with seeking hope, people seeking hope, courage, and support from religious traditions. They pray for himmat to bear the pain and suffering. If we look at the message from Maulana Hazrat Imam to his Jamaat, we find that this message was very strongly in the language of giving courage, hope, and solace to the Jamaat. And this is the role of religion that is long established, and we find it in the Quran as well, that the Quran says that in the remembrance of God, hearts find their satisfaction. So that's the second way which still we can find and observe in our life of finding courage. A third way in which pandemics are responded to in religious terms is what we might call theological questioning about the suffering and evil, which is often called Theodicy, or the problem of evils, where the central issue is, how does evil exist if there is an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God? And this question is faced not necessarily in events of pandemics, but in life as well, by individuals when they face tragedies, and by religious groups collectively. And I think a very prominent example of such collective questioning is in the Jewish context after the horrors of Holocaust, where this question was asked, that how did God allow this to happen? So epidemics, because they have massive suffering involved in them, sometimes even children, and those who are seen as good, innocent people, they become a prime candidate for raising the problem of evil. And that is another way in which pandemics and religions connect. So to bring together the points made so far, the three roles that we have discussed of religion and pandemics: one is explanatory role, other is courage seeking, and the third is theodicy, or problem of evil. Of course, apart from religion, there were also medical explanations of pandemic as well, although there also ultimately they connected to God by and large. Both in European and Muslim context, there were explanations based on Hippocrates and Galen's work, who had interpreted epidemics as a phenomenon resulting from the corruption of the air, water, or of particular astrological events. And thereby, the medical recommendations were often preventive, fortifying diet, rest, clean air, and also curative. And on the curative side, we will come to the fact that some kind of immunization was also noted long before our modern immunization. And in the 9th century and 10th century, Abu Zakaria Razi, a Muslim physician, published a treatise on the smallpox and measles, and for the first time differentiated between the two diseases. So there was some medical advancement was also happening, and people were trying to make sense of it. And as I mentioned, the practice of immunization also dates back hundreds of years. We know that the Buddhist monks, for example, drank snake venom to confer immunity to snake bite. And variolation, which means taking material from a person already affected by a disease and transplanting it into a healthy person as a possible protection against the disease, was also known for a very long time. It's by and large the same principle on which the vaccines works, and the various forms of variolations were performed in regions such as China, Arabia, Europe, and India. And over time, modern forms of immunization, particularly vaccines, developed It seems that the first one was in 1798 against smallpox, and it was developed through the viruses of cowpox. And over the 19th and 20th centuries, through the systematic implementation of vaccines and other immunization processes, some of the diseases have been eradicated, like smallpox in 1979. It is interesting to note that in 1897, actually, Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah took a vaccine publicly to mitigate some of the fears that the Indian communities had about the vaccine. So he played a role there as well. And in current times, in our own pandemics, we can see that these medical developments have now reduced the explanatory role of religion, and we actually explain the virus and what to do and how to cure and how to prevent in more public health and medical terms. And that is an important thing to see, that over time now the balance has shifted more towards the medical understanding rather than religious understanding, although that continues, as I explained earlier. But other roles of religion, to find himmat, to find courage, to find solace, or to see these things as a test, and to then find or to pray for God to help one through this test, is something that is very common in religious traditions right now as well, and continues to find meaning. Of course, in pockets, the whole question of blaming also is there, and we have seen it in this time around as well. Also, the question of suffering and theodicy and problem of evil also remains. So in some ways, except that the explanatory role has gone down, it has been taken up more by science and medicine in particular, the rest of the roles of the society seem to be there. And in fact, some more things have been added, because technology has now allowed us to respond creatively to some of the changes that the virus has forced on us. For example, the closing downs of the spaces of worship and inability to perform certain rituals. As you know, people have come up with creative ways of performing prayers together, or even funerals. Or there was Ramzan, where iftar parties were held online. So in many ways, technology has also mediated the relationship between religion and pandemics. But I think one very powerful role that religion has played and can play is really to allow us to ask deeper questions about life. Both about life as well as what it means to be a religious person. Because we have seen that religious life in a way continued despite the fact that some of the long-held rituals are no longer possible. And this can help us think about what is really of essence in the religion, what really matters. And in everyday life as well, I think many people have asked this moral question about what is really important in life, what is worth living for. There were so many things that we took for granted, and we felt that our lives cannot go on without them. But we can see that that is not the case. We can give up so many things. And I have read accounts, blogs, other things which people have done an introspection, a very important part of religious life, an introspection to ask, so what is more important in my life? How was I spending my time? How was I spending my wealth? And this question of wealth takes us to another dimension, because religions also talk about social justice and equity. And in some ways we can see that epidemics and pandemics are kind of diseases that hold mirror to the human societies. And they make us ask the question of what kind of society we have created. And I think we can clearly see that the societies we have created are unequal, unjust, unfair for many, many people. And this also is a moral and religious question. And this is another way in religion and pandemic ideally should interact, is that religious people, for all the people, should ask these moral questions about what kind of world we have created, and are we happy with it? Or should we rebuild the world in a different way, which doesn't just allow us to go back to rituals and performance of in congregational context, but we should also ask the question of quality of life, the question of how the distribution of resources take place, how people are financially and otherwise recognized for the work they do. The question of environment and how we are treating environment for centuries becomes very important as well, and that also is something that we need to pay attention to. So from a religious point of view, I think we can say that there are many issues that now are in front of us, and it is a question we need to ask ourselves whether we are happy to simply think of religion in terms of rituals and doctrines and go back to it, or see the responsibility in terms of social justice and equity as well, a moral dimension of religion, and then ask the questions, the mirror that pandemic has shown to us, and take it forward in whatever ways we can to create a world which is more just and fair. And I think that ultimately would be a very important outcome if we can make that. So for example, if one thing that can come out of it is a good healthcare system for everyone around the world, because we have seen that it's one thing to fall ill, but once you fall ill, the kind of medical facilities that are available to you is a lottery. It depends on where you are, in which part of the world. Well, I think it should be a human right of each and every individual to have access to good healthcare. And looking back 30, 40, 50 years from now, if we can see that this is one thing that humanity has achieved, I think we can look back and say that with all the tragedies and sufferings, there was this silver lining, there was this one good outcome that has come. And I think this is a human issue, it's not just a religious issue. But from a religious point of view also, this becomes a very important point to consider. And I hope that this is one of the things that we will keep in mind, remember the lessons that have been learned, and work towards creating a better world. Thank you very much.